Okay, hey Steve, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Cool. So you are really an expert on the topics like clean code and design patterns and basically how to build quality code in general, right? Um,
It's something I'm interested in, yes.
yeah. Well, I read a lot of stuff you write and courses you make on Pluralsight. So I think it's really interesting. And today we're going to talk about some of those design patterns, right?
That's right.
So which ones do you have in mind? What did you bring with you?
Well, the ones I've found interesting lately, and I've been helping some of our clients with, are
Mhm.
things that help you with cross-cutting concerns. So if
Mm.
you've got a whole bunch of different endpoints or pages or whatever, and every single one of them, you end up having some logging, maybe some validation, maybe some exception handling.
Right.
Those are examples of cross-cutting concerns, and there's a few patterns that are really good at pulling those things out, so you don't have as much repetition and sort
Mm.
of establishing a policy for them. So to answer your question, the specific patterns would be the decorator and then the mediator combined with the chain of responsibility pattern are the ones we're going to talk about today.
Cool.
Cool.
Well, I'd say let's dive right in.
All right. Well, let's get the screen up there. Perfect. And hey, everybody, it's me, Steve, and we're going to talk about, like I said, the decorator and these other patterns. Let me move some windows around here for a sec. Here we go. And so to get started, let's just dive right in with the decorator pattern. And so the decorator pattern has a UML diagram. If you're familiar with that, looks kind of like this, where you have this component. The component has some operation that it performs. Maybe you have an interface, maybe you have a base class, and you have a concrete version of that component that does a thing, whatever that might be. Maybe it's like saving an order. And currently, all the logic for saving an order is inside of that concrete component. So you may have to create the abstraction first. And so you create an interface or maybe a base class, and you inherit from it, and you just do what you're doing now, right? It has all the logic. It's doing logging, it's doing validation, it's creating the order, it's doing everything, right? But now, once you have that common base abstraction, you can create another implementation of it that is the decorator. And the thing about the decorator is that it can just add on additional behavior to the original thing, right? And so what that means is that you could take some cross-cutting thing out of that original behavior that was doing too much, had too many responsibilities. And you could say, I don't really want all the logging logic to be inside of the create order method. I want to take the basics of logging to say that I'm starting this method and I'm ending this method. Maybe you've got a timer or stopwatch. You want to see how long it takes. Right? I want to pull that out because I'm going to use that on a lot of different methods in my system. I want to consistently log, methods at this level of abstraction and see how long they take and see, that they ran and that they completed successfully or whatever it might be. Right. And I'm going to take those log statements. I'm going to put those into the decorator. And so now the decorator takes in the concrete implementation into it, usually through dependency injection, sometimes through inheritance. And so it calls in and does the original work, but it adds this other work around it. So it sort of wraps it like a nesting doll. And so you can stack decorators just like you can have multiple levels of nesting dolls, so that as you look at those various cross-cutting concerns like validation and caching, logging, exception handling, you can have a different decorator for each one of those, and make it so that you can decorate multiple different kinds of components with those same decorators in many cases. So it looks something like this, where in the original version, let's say you're hitting an API endpoint called order endpoint, .NET has to create with its dependency injection model all the different classes that are going to be involved. And it has to create them in reverse order of how they're going to be used. So the endpoint is created after its dependencies. So if we just go down the list of things here in the sequence diagram, you'll see that in the initial version, it creates the order service, then it creates the endpoint, and then something calls the handle method when someone makes a request. And then inside of that endpoint, maybe it's doing some logging, then it calls the order service, and then it logs again. Right? And that's the whole flow. If we want to add a decorator, then it would start to look something like this, where we create all the things, right? We create the order service to pass to the decorator, and then we pass the decorator to the order endpoint. Now, the order endpoint doesn't necessarily know that, because remember, the decorator is implementing the same interface as the order service. we're not showing the interfaces here, but imagine we have some iOrder service interface. Well, logging order service decorator implements that iOrder service interface, and so does order service, of course. Right. So now we're still going to call the handle method, and now the logging statements are going to take place in the decorator, and the creation of the order is the only thing order service has to worry about. So order service gets a little bit cleaner, a little smaller. The logging decorator only has to do one thing, only has to worry about logging. And we can reuse that type of logic in many places. Frequently, we could create a generic decorator, or we could have a decorator that can decorate any broader, more generic service, not an iOrder service, but maybe something that does commands or creates things or whatever it might be, to make it a little bit more generic. All right, so let's go ahead and look at an example here in the slides, and then we're going to jump into the code and I'll show you some demos. So imagine that you have this role manager service. And this works with the built-in ASP.NET Core identity stuff. So it's showing you the list of roles that exist in the system in the identity model. And so this service takes in a few different dependencies. You can see it has a DB context for data access. It has a logger, a cache, and then a principal that's the user that's involved. So then inside of this list async method, it's going to do a check to make sure that you're allowed to do this. And then assuming that you're not, it's going to say, hey, you're not authorized to do this, and send back a forbidden result. And that's using my Ardalis.result NuGet package, which we're not going to talk about that pattern here, but it's a great way to send back results without having to use exceptions. Okay. And then after that, it's going to do a little bit more logging. It's going to add a try catch to do some exception handling. And then we're going to do caching. So this whole slide is basically all about doing the caching, except for this one line right here, where it's returning the actual identity DB context list of roles. Right? Everything else here is all caching logic. And you can see how, if you're going to add caching, which you totally should in most of your applications, it can really clutter up your code, right? There's a bunch of stuff going on here, from creating the cache key to calling the cache get or create async, and logging and everything else that, it's not a lot of code, but if you're doing it in many places, it certainly adds up. And then at the end of this whole thing, we've got our catch block where we're going to do some more logging, and we're going to do some logging as we exit the function. And imagine that you might also want to have a clock or something in here telling you how long it took to perform this. All right, so in here, we've got lots of stuff happening. There's access checks, logging, exception handling, caching. About the only thing we're not doing is validation. And yeah, we're also returning a list of roles, but that's almost lost in the noise of all this other stuff that's going on. Okay, so if we want to add a decorator, we'll stick to the slides for now, and then we'll jump into the code in a sec. Here we can add a caching decorator to just pull out the caching logic and pass in an instance of iRole Manager service. In this case, I'm putting on a 2 because this is the refactored version, to act as the thing I'm going to call when I do the caching and I need to call something. All right, so then quick question for the co-host here, if you're paying attention. If I implement this and I just go into ASP.NET Core's DI and I tell the DI system, hey, whenever something asks you for iRole Manager Service 2, I want you to use the Role Manager Service caching decorator, right? Because that's how I would normally wire up a dependency. If I do just that, do you see any problems that are going to happen here? Not to put you on the spot.
Let me see. So you're using iRole Manager Service 2, and
I'm also taking that same thing in my constructor.
Yeah, so the question is, you have two classes and you want to register them in the same interface. That's not going to work. Yeah,
that's right. Exactly. It's going to be an infinite loop, right? As the DI service tries to create an iRole Manager Service 2, it's going to say, oh, I know how to do that. I'll just give you one of these decorators. Let me see. What does that need? Oh, it needs an iRole Manager Service 2. Well, I know how to create that. I just need this decorator here. Right?
and iRole Manager Services all the way down.
That's right. And so if you're going to do it with this flexible approach, which you totally should, it does require a little bit more work inside of DI to say, when you create an instance of iRole Manager Service 2, I want you to use this particular instance, this decorator, but for its constructor, I want you to do it a certain way, right? So you have to add, using the default stuff, you have to add a lambda that basically provides it with the right dependencies to pass into its constructor. If you use another DI tool like AutoFac, it's a little bit easier. It's got an overload for decorators specifically to solve this problem. But the built-in DI doesn't, so you have to write a little bit more code yourself. All right,
and then
so then,
and to tie into that, Steve, also that is also the way you could make sure that you have a certain order if you have multiple decorators in which
yes.
they are called, right? That's also that you
Correct,
then
exactly.
can
That's how you
influence. Yeah,
wrap them in the correct sequence, right? Because if I'm
exactly.
doing
Yeah.
caching, I may want to log inside the cached version, or I may want to log
Mhm.
outside, or even both. And
Exactly.
so how I register those will determine that exactly.
Hmm.
Now, it's not required that you use an interface for this. I could instead have said that this thing that I'm passing in, this dependency, wasn't an interface, but was a concrete class. I could say this
Mhm.
thing is going to get the role manager service, right?
Yeah.
The concrete one. The problem with that is it's not nearly as flexible, right? Now I don't have the ability to change the order of my decorators. It'll be hard coded into their dependencies in their constructor.
Exactly. Yeah. Makes
All
sense.
right. So next, this is what the code would look like for the list async in the decorator that's doing the caching. And so you can see that this is just the caching code, right? It doesn't have any of the other stuff going on. There is one log statement because we still want to add something about a cache miss here so we can see when that happens. But the general, start and end logging is not here, nor is there any information about how we're going to get this list, right? It's not using a DB context. It's not talking to Entity Framework Core necessarily. And so if I need to swap that out with a different implementation, or if the next thing I call is in fact another decorator and not the concrete thing that goes to the database, I have that option. All right. And so now the original service gets a lot simpler too, right? So once I've pulled everything out into decorators, that original service that was just getting the list of roles is literally just getting the list of roles. Like it's this one line here is all that's left after you perform these refactorings. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into some code and show what this looks like. And so down here, I've got some services. I've got this role manager service. This is the one that I was just showing you. And so this list async, right, does a check, then does some logging to say we're calling this, does the cache stuff in a try catch. It's exactly the code you just saw. And if we run this, let's see, we'll go ahead and kick it off again. Web server is listening. There we go. So if we run this, we're in here, we're going to say, give me a list of roles by default. And we'll just try this out, execute, see if it's still working. And we got a couple roles, subscribers and administrators. And let's pull up the actual output here. And so this is not using decorators yet. And so you can see the name of the thing that's doing the logging here is the service itself, right? And so here it says, I'm calling this. I didn't hit the cache. And then I'm exiting it. Okay. So then let's look at the decorator version. So inside of this decorators folder, I've got 3 decorators, one for authorization. And so this authorization decorator takes in an iRole manager service 2, and it just does that code that was doing the authorization check, right? But now it's been pulled out into its own single responsibility following decorator that just does that one thing. Likewise, the caching one we already looked at. All it does is the caching, nothing else. And then there's also the logging decorator, and it just says, I'm calling this thing, do the other stuff, log the exceptions. It's not just doing logging, it's also doing the try catch. But that's because the finally is where that logging logic lives. And so inside the try, it's just calling the other role manager service. Now, what order should these be called in? Well, that's not determined here, right? It could be. I could have said here that this one was going to wrap everything. And so it would call, let's say, the caching one, and then the caching one would call the authorization one, or vice versa, right? Probably the authorization one should be the outermost one. If you're not authorized, we just exit early and don't do any other work. And so we could determine that here, but then it's not very flexible, right? We can't change it easily. And so instead, we can set it all up inside program.cs when we wire up this code. Let me just slide this out of the way. And so right here, or actually, let's go here. So the initial one was right there. I just wanted to wire up a service, right? So I have an iRole manager service. I add a role manager service, done, right? Super simple. That's what we're used to. If you want to use decorators, and in this case, it's a somewhat complicated one because I've got 3 decorators I'm going to stack together. This is how it looks. You're going to add your original service. That's the innermost thing. That doesn't really change, but notice I didn't assign it to an interface, right? I didn't say it goes to this interface. I just said, hey, you need to know about this class because you're going to have to create it, but don't tie it to any interface. And then in here, I'm going to say when I add this role manager service caching decorator, I have to provide it with this Lambda that says how to do its job. And the important one right here is that it's going to say for the caching decorator, the wrapped service, which is the first parameter I'm going to pass in, is going to be role manager service 2. So the innermost thing is caching. Well, the innermost thing is the role manager service. And then caching is next, right? And then logging is next after that. So when we look at the logging one, we say, well, what is the wrapped service? It's the caching one is wrapped by logging. And then the authorization one wraps the logging one. And here, that's where we wire it up to the interface. So there's only one thing in both cases. There's one thing wired up to iRole Manager service, and that's this role manager service. And down here, way down here at the bottom, this is where we wire up the iRole Manager service 2 to the decorator. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Totally.
Yeah.
All right. And so if we then run that.
So it's a lot of code, though.
It is a lot of
Would be
code.
nice to use AutoFac.
Yeah, it would. It's not no code in AutoFac. There's still a chunk of code, but it's certainly a lot less. All right, so then let's look at what that looks like when we actually run it. We'll get rid of this one. We'll call roles decorators, and we'll try it out. In fact, we'll execute it. We got a result. We'll execute it a couple times. I just want to see the caching work. All right, and so in here, we can scroll down and we can see that now we're hitting things with decorators, right? You see decorators is right here. And so we hit the logging decorator. Then we hit the caching decorator and we say cache miss, getting it from the database. You could see the actual SQL that's executed here. But then we hit it a few more times and we're not hitting the cache. We're not seeing the cache miss, right? So we still see the decorator for list async. That's telling us that, that was the original one that we're executing. Now we can see we're authorizing, we're calling, we're executing, we're authorizing, we're calling, we're exiting, not executing, exiting, right? And so it's working. And if I hit it one more time, we should see a cache miss again because enough time passed, right? And so here you see it's executing the query again because it was a cache miss right there. All right, so it's still doing the same behavior in the same way, but now all the things have been moved into their own place. But yes, this is a fairly large chunk of code. And sure, we could pull that out into an extension method or hide it away somewhere. But imagine it, for every service you write that needs to use caching or logging or whatever, you got to do all this work for decorators. And you can make a generic one. And what that might look like is you might have a generic service. Instead of having an iRole Manager service, let's go look at that for a second. Right, this thing has a list async that returns something like a list of identity role. Right. Well, I could make this generic and I could say I have a public interface of read service of T. And then in here, I could say, this thing returns back the same thing, a task of a result of a list of so many things deep T. And we'll just say it's going to be, let's say, list async, like that. Right. Now I can make that I read service T something that then has a generic decorator that does caching and a generic decorator for logging and probably not authorization. That might be a little tougher because these will probably have different authorization rules, but maybe. But that means I don't have to have a decorator per every instance of every service, right? Because that's just a crazy amount of code.
Yeah.
But there is another way, even better than generics for decorators. So let's jump back to the slides for a second, talk about that. If there's no questions. Any questions, any thoughts, ideas, something I missed?
No, I don't think so. One thing you haven't mentioned explicitly yet is that I think it's also really nice for unit testing because,
for sure.
Of course, if you have one big class, then of course you can create different unit tests for it. But because it's now already divided into these distinct concerns, you are also really focused when you're writing unit tests on just the caching part or just the authorization part. So that's one of the benefits I really like about it.
So this is following solid principles, and I could do a whole other talk on solid, but this is all about single responsibility in this case, which gives you the better testability, right? Like if I want to test that this line of code works correctly, I've got to set up a test in which the person calling it is in the correct role. And that has nothing to do with whether or not this part works, right? That's great. And then I have to make sure that I don't accidentally hit the cache. Trying to do unit tests on things that have a cache involved is really a pain. And so, if you can get rid of that stuff, you still want to test it, but you don't need to test it all together with everything else. You want to have seams in your code so that you can test each piece in isolation. And that's what this type of decomposition really lets you do.
Yeah, and of course, clarity of the code, right? If you now look at the actual business code that actually does stuff, is also only the stuff it needs to do, and not all kinds of different concerns that it needs to be busy with. So yeah, I think it makes it a lot clearer where everything is situated in this code base.
It does. It does. Now, like any abstraction, it makes it clear if you just watched this video and I just explained how I pulled it all apart and where it all was. If you were just joining this team and there was this role manager service thing and it was right there.
You have to pull up the documentation, right?
You don't necessarily know these decorators are a thing. And so when you run the code and suddenly it's cached and sometimes it's not cached and sometimes it's got, authorization, and you're looking at this, you're like, where is that? Right? There is a learning curve in using these abstractions. And so you have to understand that the decorator pattern is a thing and that the decorator pattern is being used here and how. And then you can just say, hey, role manager service, find me all references or find me all, implementations of this here. And now you could see decorator. And it's, if you know what decorators are, you can pretty easily figure out what's going on here. But if you don't know that, and that's part of why it's valuable to learn about these patterns, it would be a little more difficult for you if you're all by yourself, just starting out working on this code base, to know the magic that was happening around this method.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So
especially if you start by looking at dependency injection code.
Yeah.
Well, sure, right. And if you didn't dig into this, because this is going to be really long for an application that only uses this type of technique, right? That's going to be pretty intimidating for someone to look at, day one jumping into the project. If it's got 50 or more services, let's say, and there's just all this code, like what the heck is going on here, right? That would get pretty intimidating.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So there's another pattern that also does similar things. And so we're going to get to it, but first we're going to stop along the way and talk about the mediator pattern. And I don't have as many slides for this one, so we're going to be pretty quick. But basically, the mediator pattern is going to turn things around a little bit, change up the order a little bit, so that the endpoint code, the second column here, the order endpoint, doesn't have a direct reference or knowledge of the order service anymore. So remember back a few slides, let's go look at the other one, just so we're all on the same page. Here, the endpoint is directly referencing the order service. Originally, it was referencing it totally directly, right? Just it asked for one of those in its constructor, and then it called it directly here. And then if we wanted to add decorators, it was pretty much the same thing, except it didn't know that we were swapping in this other implementation, but it was still calling, what it thought was some kind of an order service to do the work. All right. When we jump to Mediator, the pattern, not necessarily the library, not mediate R, although that's a very common library. When you use a mediator, its job is to be a messenger and pass your messages on to somewhere, right? And where it passes it on is not your concern, right? The order endpoint doesn't need to know, doesn't get to know where the actual work is going to be done. All it knows is that I'm handing a message off to the mediator. It's going to go do its thing, and it's going to come back and let me know what happened. And so in this case, what Mediator is going to do is after it has sent a command, a handler is going to be called. This create order command handler is the typical name you would give it, and then it's the handler's job to go and create the service and call. Well, the service would already have been created here, but would call order service dot create to do the work, and then return all the way back to order endpoint and give it, here's the order that I just created or whatever it might be as a result. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And Mediator is a pretty common pattern these days. So let's just jump into the code and look at what that looks like for a moment from the endpoint. So if we do something here, right, let's first look at our list, original list endpoint, because we kind of skipped that part. So in here we've got an endpoint. I'm using what am I using? Our Dallas API endpoints for this. This is a little bit older example of mine. If I were doing it today, I'd probably use another library called Fast Endpoints. But either way, they let you have one endpoint class for each endpoint for an API. And both of them use the same Reaper pattern, request, endpoint, response. And so this endpoint for a list doesn't have a request, but it has a response, a role list response. And it takes in this service, and all it does is in here is a way to call to get that list and then return the result. When we do it with decorators, nothing really changes, right? It still just asks for iRole Manager Service 2 in this case. Interesting that also works for iRole Manager Service, but since I asked for a 2 here, it still worked. That should probably be a 2 there. And so nothing else changed, okay? But now when we switch to using Mediator, notice that all we know about is Mediator. We don't know anything about the actual thing that's going to end up doing the work, right? And so now this code pretty much looks the same, but it's very generic. The only thing that tells us what it is that we're doing is the actual requests that we're passing around. I don't have any types for the thing that's going to do the work. I only have types for the messages that are going to get passed to and possibly returned from. In that case, this would be this response is the thing coming from the mediator. Okay, and so when you have code that looks like this, one of the things that you can start to see is that we don't have very much code inside these endpoints anymore. Right? I never did in this case because I was doing most of the work in the service. But it's not unusual to have companies and programs that have a ton of work inside the endpoint itself. And so using Mediator is a great way to get that stuff out of the endpoint or out of the controller and put it into those handlers that just do one thing. All right. So then,
well, I think what's also good to mention here, Steve, is that you mentioned messages, but it's really a message object, right? So
Exactly, yeah.
you don't need to have a message bus infrastructure and do this all asynchronously and with
Correct.
eventual consistency. This is just
this is
in
purely
memory object
in memory,
passing.
in process. You can debug through it the whole way. There's no RabbitMQ or Azure Service Bus or any of that in here. It's just moving things around using object-oriented programming patterns. Right. Yeah. That's what Decorator is. That's what Mediator is. And that's what chain of responsibility is, which we're going to see in just a moment. So the basic thing that I would do with Mediator like this is I would send this list roles request, and then something would be wired up as a handler to respond to that. So if I look at my handler here, I have a list roles handler, and it takes in a service and does whatever the work is. And so in here, this is the whole handler. All it does is call the service and say, hey, give me the list and return that result. And so it's pretty trivial. But if I want to add more behavior to it, I can. And the way that works is through what's called behaviors in the case of Mediator. And those would let me add all those different cross-cutting concerns. So imagine that I'm kind of skipping a step here. Imagine that in the handler or in the service, I'm still doing authorization checks and caching and error handling and logging, all that stuff. And so that code would be, right here. And so instead of this whole thing being, 20 lines of code or 12 lines of code or whatever it is without the using statements, it would be a lot bigger, right? Right. We've already pulled all that out and put it into behaviors. And so a caching behavior looks like this. This is still using Mediator, and it's an iPipeline behavior of request and response. What am I taking in? What am I giving back? And so in here, the way this works is pretty much just like middleware in ASP.NET Core. We're going to do the caching work, but inside of the cache, instead of saying a specific thing I'm going to call, instead of calling a service and saying call this service.list async, I'm just going to call next. Whatever the next thing is, that's what's going to get called. And so this is exactly what middleware looks like. If you've ever written custom middleware for ASP.NET Core, it just calls next at some point. And then you can add code above or below that call to next that gives you a place to hook in additional behavior. And so you can stack these. You can have a logging behavior as well. And so in this case, here's where the call to next is. And then around that, I can have additional logging statements to say that, something happened and I've already called it. So now I can say I'm finished with it, right? And I've got other things I can do ahead of times. And these behaviors can be fairly generic, right? So they don't have to be, but you notice this logging behavior doesn't know anything about list of roles or list roles result or anything like that. It works for any T request and T response. But it can still be pretty specific in the log output about what's happening, because it can inspect those messages and it can say, hey, I'm going to expect every T request to have a name. And if it does, I'm going to put that into the log output. And so that way you can see, logging that doesn't just say, hey, I logged something, right? But it can still be specific and say, I'm logging that we started doing list orders or list roles or whatever. And then, show the appropriate information. You can even do simple things like I'm doing here, where you can grab all the properties that were on this. So imagine I was doing something like create a new order, right? And the order is going to have this, that, and the other property, for this customer, for this amount, for blah, 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 right? All those properties could be logged out here as well, just using some reflection or something similar. Could be that there's performance reasons why you wouldn't want to do it exactly like that, but it's all possible.
Okay. Yeah, I really like this type of logging where, as a application developer, you create a new feature and then you run it and you get all this logging for basically free, because somebody before you implemented this type of behavior. It's really nice.
Yep, exactly. And again, it's for any of those types of cross-cutting concerns, where if you look at a bunch of API endpoints or a bunch of services that you are working on in your application, and every single one of them is like try blah, blah, blah catch, or log starting here, log finish there. Those are the type of things that you want to pull out using some kind of pattern. And there's more than one, and there's trade-offs and pros and cons. And that's what I'm hoping to show here, is that there's different ways you can achieve the pulling out of those duplicate blocks of code into a single place in your code base where you can have a policy that defines what that behavior should be. And that allows you to then have a consistent experience in your code base, where it's not like, well, sometimes the code works like this and sometimes it works like that because, we started doing it this way and we didn't have time to go fix all the old ones, stuff like that causes bugs and inconsistency. All right,
so I'm really curious. You are using Mediator here?
Yes, this is all Mediator.
What are your thoughts on taking a dependency on a third-party library like Mediator and versus just rolling your own? Because, of course, with the third-party package, you get a lot of functionality for free. But maybe if you only use a small part, you don't want to take the dependency. So when in your case, do you decide, I'm not going to write this, this is getting too big, I'm going for a third party?
I think it varies with every different thing that you're doing. I'm pretty okay with using third-party things that are not bringing in dependencies on infrastructure concerns, right? So if it's not tying me to a particular file system, particular database, particular cloud provider, and it's just doing things in memory, like a lot of my NuGet packages that I write, like guard clauses or this result thing that we're using here, right? It's just code. It's just C# code that is running in memory as part of your application process, and there's not a whole lot that can go wrong. And so with Mediator, like there are a whole lot of things that can go wrong, and like how you do the assembly scanning and how you detect the handlers and things, open generics and other stuff. And Jimmy Bogard, the maintainer, will tell you that there's a lot of stuff that he's had to fix over the years. So that's not the kind of thing I want to be responsible for in my application, because that's not the point of my application. My application is about, doing insurance applications or creating bank accounts or whatever it is, right? Whatever my domain is. My domain is not reinventing Mediator. So for things like that, I'll usually reach for an off-the-shelf thing. I'll do some research. I'll do some due diligence. Mediator has a couple billion downloads on NuGet.org and people using it all the time. So it's pretty solid. And so I'm pretty happy to take that one on. For other ones where, it might be a relatively new thing, I might go and look at the source code and see how I like it. I might make a fork and play with it myself and see if I can break it or make it better. But for a lot of things, it's, if they've got millions of downloads on NuGet and it looks like the issues are being addressed in the open source package, I'll probably be okay to take it. Or I'll defer to whatever my client's security posture is, because a lot of times they'll have a list of approved NuGet packages that they'll allow. But really, if it came down to I can use Mediator or nothing, because it's not on the list of approved packages, I probably just wouldn't use it. And I would tell the client, like, this is not something we want to invent ourselves. I've seen the code and it's pretty not trivial. And so we wouldn't want to invent and maintain this ourselves. Either your security team needs to allow us to use Mediator or an equivalent open source or commercial tool, or we should just not use this and we have other choices, other patterns we could apply.
Right.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Good. Thanks.
Okay, so let's look at how this is wired up, and then we'll show it in action. Okay, so in here, let's scroll down a little bit, and we're going to add Mediator. Okay, so if you've never used Mediator before, this is basically what you need to do to set it up. You just need to say add Mediator, and then you need to tell it the assemblies where the various messages and handlers live. And so in this case, this is a single project demo. And so everything is in just one assembly. And so it's pretty simple, but if you wanted to, you could pass it a list of assemblies here. And it would look in all those assemblies for those types. Then I'm going to say I want to add the mediator authorization and the authorizers here to do some of the pipeline stuff. And then the generic pipeline stuff I'm doing right here for logging is just saying this is how you register generics in .NET DI. So I can't just say, add a scope of pipeline behavior to logging behavior. I have to say type of, and then this sort of strange syntax here where you have to pass in just the commas inside your generic type. And so in this case, these all are request, comma, response. And so I have to pass in just one comma. We're going to do the same thing with well, I'm not. I'm going to show you another thing with attributes. But if I wanted to add caching, I would do it right here the same way. And so the caching behavior would then apply to everything. And it doesn't necessarily make sense to apply caching to everything in your pipeline. And so that's why this one is commented out, and we're actually using attributed behaviors. And some of you, maybe even if you've used Mediator a bit, you don't know about this cool extension. But with attributed behaviors, you can add attributes to your behaviors to say when they should be in effect. So if we look at the caching behavior, this thing is dependent on the caching attribute, and list pipeline attributes has somewhere there's an attribute. I think it's on the message. So list role list request. Let's go to that one here, and then this is where you specify the behaviors that are on that. And so with this mediator behavior attribute, you can say this one, when it goes through the pipeline, should have a logging behavior, and then it should have a caching behavior, and then it should call the actual handler. And so that's how that is defined if you use that attributes one. That's not part of Mediator itself, but it's an add-on.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, this is how you make it kind of an opt-in model. So you can just say which behaviors you want to use. So and not all classes will have the same behaviors that you specified in the program CS.
That's right.
Right.
Now,
cool.
one quick thing to notice. This is kind of newish. At least it was new for me when I first discovered this. But notice I do have the logging behavior wired in for everything.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then on the attribute behavior, notice that it also had the logging behavior. So right here. So what you're going to see when we see the demo, we should see the logging behavior happening twice if it's working correctly, which obviously isn't probably what you really want, but it kind of just demonstrates how this works. So if we do pipeline with attributes here, and we try it out, and we'll execute, and we see it still works. So that's the important thing. We'll execute it a few times to see what the caching stuff does. Then if we look in here, we jump down to the very bottom. You can see we have list roles. Let's see, handled this, but it also says it handled this, right? See, it's there twice, and that's because that's what the logging one does. And then the handling is here, handling twice, right? Because we got the logging in there twice. If we scroll up a bit here, you'll see this is where we had the cache miss, and we're still in the handling request with attributes, so it's still the attributes one, but we had a cache miss, and then it did the cache work there. So you don't see the cache behavior unless there's a cache miss. So if we execute it one more time, that'll get us the cache miss, and you'll see it here. So it's saying twice, hey, we're handling, and then in here it says, hey, we're doing the caching behavior is doing all this work, and then down here it says, hey, we handled it. Right,
makes sense. And
why would we like this better than a decorator?
Yeah. One question though, Steve. Is there a way to make sure that if you do this, that it can detect that you have registered twice the same behavior, and then it will only add once, or is it just up to you as the developer?
I don't think so. No, I think it's up to you to set it up correctly, right? And it's a matter of if I'm going to use attributed behaviors, I probably just want to use attributed behaviors. Or
Exactly. Yeah.
if
Don't
I
mix and
want to
match.
have things that I always want to do, like say logging, let's say, well, then I probably want to just make sure that in here, I don't use logging.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
And we'll
yeah.
just, if we run it again, we should see that problem disappears.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. But I thought maybe it has some behavior that it sees the same type being registered twice, or
I don't know that is a thing that Mediator does or even can do. It might be something where you could set a some type of exception to be thrown if it sees a duplicate handler or something, but that's not something I'm familiar with.
No.
All right, so we just ran it again. You can see right here it's starting up, and we hit the handling, and we hit the cache miss, and then we hit the handle, but it's only once. Right, we don't have it duplicating anymore.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right, so if we consider now, just from like a code analysis standpoint, what does the difference look like between the decorators, right, and how this works? So the handler, like this is the handler that's doing the work, is calling a service right here, and it's calling role manager service 2 because that was the really simple one, right? That was this one that just has one line of code, right? So all the complexity of all the other concerns is not in role manager service 2. And the handler, now the nice thing about this is that a new developer coming in here can see these things. They may not immediately know what that means, but it's like if they run the code and they see, hey, it's doing caching, well, at least they can see in the same file, like, oh yeah, I can see they're doing something here with caching with whatever this attribute is, right? And they have some thread to then follow to try and figure it out. More so, I was able to make this work with anything that is an iRequest handler of anything, right? And so I don't have to make sure that I have a particular interface that looks a certain way, so that it only works for I don't know, I list whatever I called that interface I was making up before, right? Like this works for anything. As long as I give it a message to pass and a message to get back, it'll work, right? And so it's much more flexible, I think, than Decorator. And then when you look at what's involved in program, right, there's a little bit of work set up here for Mediator. It's basically that code right there. But that's just set it up for everything, right? With this code, and a lot of it is commented out because we could throw it away. Like this line we don't need because I'm not using it because we're using the attribute. But with just this attributed behaviors and this Mediator code, those two together, they're doing most of the heavy lifting. And then I've got the authorization stuff a little bit separate. It's pretty straightforward, right? And certainly those 4 or 5 lines of code you need could go in an extension method that says wire up Mediator behaviors, and then that's everything is just there, and there's just one line in your program CS at that point. So it's pretty nice as far as how clean it is in terms of how much surface area it's taking up in program.cs, and it's fairly discoverable with the attributes, especially what's going on here. There's one last benefit of this that I'll point out, which is that once you do this, it's very portable. So like another thing we could have done, I mentioned handlers a few times, right? So down here, this is where we wire up all our handlers for ASP.NET Core. Could I have put in, right here, this is a logging handler, and then right here, this is a caching handler. Could I have done all this with middleware? Yes. Right. I could have done all this stuff with middleware if I'd wanted to, but then it would only ever work in ASP.NET Core, right? And this is an older thing. You can see it's using controllers. I could have done it all with filters, right? But filters only work with MVC. So as soon as ASP.NET Core does something, I don't know, crazy, like creates a new way to do web handlers, like minimal APIs, suddenly all my filters stop working, right? They're not portable. All the stuff we do here with Mediator and these behaviors, I can do that inside of a console app. I can do that inside of a Windows service, or I can do that inside of a Lambda. Anything that supports just running some .NET code and supports DI, because Mediator kind of depends on the DI working. It will work for anywhere that's going to happen. All right, and so I'm no longer coupled to this particular version of ASP.NET Core and how they're implementing middleware. I've got my own pipeline that I can do whatever I want with.
Yeah, and that also makes it work with deeper nested code, right? So let's say you are handling a command and maybe you want to publish an event that gets handled by another handler. Then in the internal passing of the event, that will also get logged and cached
Right.
and stuff. I'm not
Yep.
sure if you would want caching there, but it would also go through that same pipeline.
That's right. Right. And this pipeline could also be done on the client side. If you're doing Blazor, which a lot of folks are, and you want to do WebAssembly, Mediator runs in WebAssembly just fine. This whole pipeline runs just fine in WebAssembly. So maybe you want to have something like a behavior for doing retries when APIs time out, or checking to see if the token is expired and automatically getting a new token. That could just be in a behavior instead of having it in every single time you try and make a HTTP call inside Blazor. It works great for that too. So it's not just server side that this could make sense, but client side as well.
Cool.
All right. So with that, let's talk about the name of the pattern. I haven't mentioned that so much, but the thing that we're doing with these behaviors with this pipeline is called chain of responsibility. And the idea is to kind of put it in a sequence of things that can get called, sort of like nesting dolls. I mentioned that it's how middleware works. Here's kind of the sequence diagram of what it looks like. And we already saw the code for this, but if you want to see how it all lays out in a nice sequence diagram, Mediator is still involved, but now the behavior is in its own separate class before the handler, before the service. And it's a lot of types, right? Don't get me wrong. There's a lot more types here than there were in the very first version. But each type is only doing one thing. And everything's kind of stitched together like Lego bricks, and we can swap the order around if we want, right? There's only one behavior here, but in the demo I just showed you saw there were several, and we can easily rearrange the order in which those take place. So the main takeaway I want folks to have here is that they should be looking for cross-cutting concerns and then figuring out ways to pull out that duplication into some central place where they can define a policy that is the one and only place that behavior lives. And that can be done with decorators, or that can be done with chain of responsibility. There's pros and cons for each one. Decorator is a little bit simpler to do and doesn't depend on any third-party libraries. But if you can use Mediator and its support for pipeline behaviors, then you can pretty easily get chain of responsibility working. And that turns out to be a much more flexible approach in my experience. So here's more info about me and Nimble Pros, and free course on Solid in your inbox if you want with this email course. But otherwise, I'm happy to answer any other questions, or keep going if you like.
Yeah. So that was great. Great to see this on patterns. I have to admit I've learned about all these design patterns before, and I've used some, but to see them in code and to actually see them working in .NET code, that's really helpful. And also the cool trick with the decorators and the attributes for Mediator, that's really cool. I didn't know that. So for me, it was a really informal session. So thanks for that. I don't know if you have any questions, Sander. I don't, but maybe you have some questions for Steve.
I share your thoughts. Really interesting. The thing is with these kind of sessions, I get really excited to try. I want to try it myself, right? I really get excited to write some code. Yeah. I think I'm going to do that. Thank you so much, Steve. This was really nice.
Yeah,
you're welcome.
Also, anybody at home watching, if you like .NetFlix, please subscribe to the channel, and then we'll see you at the next episode. Bye-bye.